Well, good afternoon, everybody. Tá me ouvindo Are you hearing me in Portuguese? Okay. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to our third and final Ambassadors Water Expert United States and Rio Grande do Sul Cooperation for Drought Mitigation. I'm Alexandra Stein. I'm the Counselor for Economic and Political Affairs at the U.S. Consulate in Porto Alegre. And I'm very happy to be here with you today for our third and final session of this program. Our previous two sessions talked about integrated drought risk management and planning and how to use data to manage risk. And today's session offers a slightly different perspective, but one that together we thought was very important, which is holistic planning and comprehensive planning and inclusivity for water resource management, including participatory resource management, excuse me. This program was made possible thanks to the Department of Interior's International Technical Assistance Program, who worked to bring together US-based experts across areas to respond to needs that our working group here, a partnership led by the US Consulate Porto Alegre, which represents the US Department of State, along with the Rio Grande do Sul Secretariats for Environment and the Secretariat for Agriculture. And a special thanks to Elizabeth and her team for all their support, and from the State Department's Office of Environment and Science. Today, if you have any questions or would like any further information at any point, please just reach out. This is an opportunity to share information and to share experience. We have as much to learn from the US, from Brazil, as we hope you do from our experiences. And interaction and your ideas make these conversations richer. We have a wonderful team of interpreters here to help us facilitate language gaps, so please feel free to speak up. And now, without further ado, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Secretary Domingos Lopez, the Secretary for Environment for Rio Grande do Sul and a great partner of the US Consulate in the United States. Secretario, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex Stein. Always very competent, very dedicated for this partnership. I desire and I acknowledge all the work that we started in February this year. It was born at the height of the drought in Rio Grande do Sul, the worst event we've had as far as drought. And at that point, we got closer to the consulate, the productive sector, and we were able to, with the state secretaries, and I want to cheer the Secretary of Agriculture and Marjorie, who is not able to be here with us today, but she will see this, the recording later. I would like to thank this integration that is happening between the consulate, the experts, the technicians that work to mitigate drought, how to deal with that, and this exchange of information. I see my co-workers, the people from the Secretariat of Agriculture, the Environment and Infrastructure, the Department of Water Resources for the state. I desire everyone a great afternoon of work. And mainly, I would like to thank on behalf of the government of Rio Grande do Sul for the opportunity that we are creating in this exchange of technical information, and mainly this very good work and complementary work of information that actually brings information and is going to leave a legacy of exchange of experiences for what we consider most severe for the environment sector and agriculture production as a whole, which is analysis and validation, extreme care regarding the water resources and the effects to mitigate drought. So, Alexandra, I would like to say that I hope we're gonna have a great afternoon of work. I'd like to thank, as you said, this is the third and last session of the stage. I'd like to put the technicians from the state of Rio Grande do Sul uh, to available, not for the last, but for many other programs we may have together, and also say that it's a pleasure to be able to share information with a network of experts and technicians of the highest quality, which made this work so much better, and especially the dedication and the very professional way they dealt with the people from the state of Rio Grande do Sul. Likewise, I'd like to say once again that we're going to be at COP27, as Secretary Marjorie told you yesterday. We have the idea, we're going to be governed and led in this agenda by the state governor, Randolfo Vieira Jr., and he requested that we, in the stand of the United States between the 10th and the 12th, if you could schedule for us to go there and exchange experiences and show the legacy from this work, which I am sure is a great experience, not just for Brazil and the United States, but an example to be followed. And in the institutional relationships between countries, in exchange of information, an agenda that is extremely important: sustainability, food security, and things regarding water resources and the effects of droughts. This way, I bring the ideas from Secretary Marjorie, who has been a great leader in sustainability and environment and the transversality of the productive sector, and also from all the colleagues I have here together with us. And our thanks from the state to you, the American Consulate, the technician experts that participated in this job. And may we have a lot of success ahead of us. May this be the seed of larger works ahead of us. May we have more interchange to find joint solutions between the United States and Brazil, specifically our state of Rio Grande do Sul. We are really pleased with the results of this work, and I am certain it will give us great results. Thank you, Alexandra. Tell your work team that the Rio Grande do Sul is a partner for all actions to mitigate not just the effects of drought, but any project that works regarding food security, energy and sustainability in our state, our country. And thank you for the opportunity. May we have a great afternoon of work.
Thank you so much, Secretario Domingos, for being our complete partner throughout this process. And thank you for your words as well, highlighting that Rio Grande do Sul will be present at the COP in a couple weeks. We'll talk offline. We definitely like to support your mission as best we can. We, of course, think it's very, very important to show the work we're doing together to fight climate change, to ensure global food security. And this program that we're running today is one example. And like you said, it's a seed for hopefully much more cooperation. We're here to cooperate, and I hope everybody on the line really gets this message as well, that our doors are completely open. And when there's an idea or a way to develop, or an idea that's coming from Brazil that you think might work in the United States, we're here to receive it, process it, and help move it along. So thank you really very much for that cooperation. And we wish Secretary Marjorie a great visit in Cairo. So from here, I'd like to shift into our program. And to do so, we have two speakers today, and I'll take just a moment to provide their biographies before we go into a series of presentations. So I'd like to again welcome Dr. Melinda Leituri and Dr. Timothy Silberg, who are visiting. And I did say US-based experts earlier, but I will note that Timmy is not so far away from us at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. So we really welcome him and his expertise as well. Melinda Leituri has a PhD from the University of Arizona, Tucson, Arizona in geography, focused on environmental equity and groundwater resources in the American Southwest and the US-Mexico border. She's a former National Science Foundation Program Officer in Geography and Spatial Sciences, a Fulbright Scholar, a Rachel Carson Fellow, where she conducted comparative research of major rivers. Dr. Leituri is the director of the Geospatial Centroid at the Colorado State University that provides information and support for geographic information systems, GIS, activities, education and outreach at CSU and in Colorado. In 2014 to 2015, Dr. Leituri was a Jefferson Science Fellow and continues working with the Office of the Geographer and Global Issues at the US Department of State on the Secondary Cities Initiative, which I'm sure she'd be happy to comment on. She's a visiting scientist at the Center for Geographic Analysis at Harvard. She's worked with Indigenous peoples throughout the world on issues related to natural resource management, disaster adaptation, and water resource issues using GIS that utilize cultural and eco-physical data and research models. A key focus is participatory GIS, where Indigenous people develop spatial information and maps essential for their management of their own resources. And I really look forward to her presentations today. But before we begin, I'll also share Dr. Silberg's bio. Dr. Timothy Silberg is an agrosystems researcher with over a decade of experience in international agricultural development. He's currently a Fulbright postdoctoral fellow at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, UFSC. At UFSC, he leads a research team to investigate the adoption of biogas technologies among pork producers for the purpose of developing a simulator to project agroenergy production, something I'm sure people here in Rio Grande do Sul would also like to know about. Dr. Silberg has a PhD in community sustainability with a specialization in ecological food and farming systems, a Master's of Science in Agricultural Leadership, Education, and Communications, and a Bachelor's of Science in Agriculture Sciences with a minor in International Agriculture. He's been involved with several development and research projects across the globe, including St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Trinidad and Tobago, Haiti, Guatemala, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Malawi, and now here in Brazil. Dr. Silberg has consulted for Casual Design and the Adam Smith Institute, advising funders how best to catalyze legume and bioenergy markets. Today, he serves as the program coordinator for the USAID-funded Malawi University of Science and Technology Innovation Scholars Program. Welcome to you, Dr. Silberg. Welcome again to you, Dr. Leituri. And without further ado, Dr. Leituri, I'd invite you to open up with your first presentation on the hydrosocial cycle and diagrams of causal loops.
Great, thanks so much for that great introduction. I'm going to share my screen right now. And can everyone see that? Okay, thanks so much. So thanks for that great introduction and the opportunity to present today. Timmy and I are going to tag team a bit, where I'm going to present for a little while, and then Timmy will present, and I'll explain how that will be organized. We're going to be presenting on participatory methods and stakeholder engagement for drought management. A requirement of any type of resource management approach and disaster preparedness planning is the need for local data at the appropriate scale. We need to build inclusive strategies with local communities to understand their perceptions and adaptive capacity to complement expert opinion and the scientific knowledge base. We need local data for place-based decision-making through soliciting input from people most impacted by drought conditions, including the most vulnerable sectors. Necessarily, this is a dynamic process, depending on the resources available, the explicit data needs, and the impacts of climate change that influence exposure to disasters and food security. Both Timmy and I will provide some examples of interactive hands-on exercises that can be done, but which are very challenging in the virtual environment. It would be so much nicer if we were face-to-face. So first of all, just a short overview of where we've been with these series of workshops. We have looked at the US Drought Monitor that uses multiple data sources, satellite assessments of vegetation, soil moisture indicators, hydrologic and climate data to map drought conditions across the US, created through partnerships with multiple US agencies. We've had presentations from NASA and USDA, the Department of Agriculture in the United States, that showed the use of satellite weather station data, statistical information to assess crop conditions, agricultural production, and climate and water metrics. These examples reveal the utility of global data sets, the ability to disaggregate data to state or province scale data. For example, OpenET is really an exciting project because it's applied to the field level water consumption in the Western United States, and they presented several use case studies of what they're doing. Great satellite imagery that gives us information about terrestrial water storage. The World Agricultural Outlook Board that utilizes climate station data from around the world. And then the Foreign Agricultural Service that provides assessments of global agricultural production. All of these programs are built upon cutting-edge science, partnerships with strong outreach to users. They demonstrate how products from remote sensing and statistical models can create data products for your area of interest. We also were shared the drought monitoring portal that is being developed in Brazil. Eduardo Martins presented this to us. This is creating a partnership with Brazilian experts as well as US agencies, using the 3 pillars of diagnosis, planning, and mitigation. It's an ongoing effort to build this infrastructure. And Eduardo presented on this product, and he described the water crisis in Brazil. And Timmy and I are going to focus our presentation today on water management at the local scale. There's a rich array of existing data that's very helpful for monitoring and assessing drought conditions and crop patterns that's generally limited to the country or state scale and the resolution of the satellite images. However, we find that fine scale spatial data is what we need and what's often lacking in our data sets. So some questions to consider when working with local people and thinking about this issue. Does the resolution of the data match local needs? Are these tools for data collection adaptable for water management in changing conditions and local areas? Kelly Smith from the Drought Mitigation Center listed several methods of outreach for engagement and participation with local stakeholders, emphasizing the need for local data at the appropriate scale to address the topics critical to those stakeholders. So those are 3 key issues that are very important: local data, the appropriate scale, and local stakeholder needs. We need avenues for collaboration to develop novel uses of data and identify data gaps and needs. So what Timmy and I want to speak with you about today is we're going to discuss the following: First, a description of the hydrosocial cycle, which is a general framework to integrate hydrology and society that's critical to participatory community engagement. We'll discuss causal loop diagrams and how they can help us understand the cause and effect of droughts on society and assist in identifying data needs. This will be also informed by an exercise where we look at the 5 whys, the 5 whys that help us to identify root causes beyond the physical environment to tease out the social context. And then to consider what some of the participatory methods are that we can use to identify and engage with stakeholders, collect local data, and allow participation and ownership and problem solving when we meet significant problems. All of these can help us to develop a systems modeling approach to conceptualize a suite of issues and identify data needs and gaps and modeling next steps. And finally, never to be far beyond what we want to be thinking about carefully are the need for data ethics, how we do data collection and work with local communities. And then we'll end with some questions. So to set the stage, a little bit about the hydrosocial cycle. The hydrosocial cycle integrates the complexity of the water cycle, environment, and people into a comprehensive approach to address water services, needs, and planning. This is holistic thinking that integrates physical and social relationships, an understanding of the meaning of such terms as landscape, ecosystem, watershed. In Brazil, you may use different terminology, and we need to understand those in terms of how they address the idea of a watershed, of looking at the hydrosocial cycle. We also want to be able to think about how we develop sustainable management of our watersheds and how we start to balance human and ecosystem demand and be able to have planning that's looking at both that integration of society and the environment in our economic landscapes. And finally, it's built upon bottom-up solutions. What do communities need and how can we best serve their needs and include them in the decision-making process? So the hydrosocial cycle, what am I really talking about? It's a diagram, a framework to integrate hydrology and society. And it's a useful tool, I think, to understand relationships and linkages, to be able to look at the relationship between water in terms of H2O, meaning the physicality of water, our water sources, our river systems, the groundwater, the precipitation, to understand the social power structure in terms of the social production, the social understanding of water, what sorts of regulations are in place, what are the laws in place, how do we understand what water is to communities and societies, and then the technology necessary for modifying the water system through infrastructure and how we deliver water to various users. So our emphasis here is on irrigated agriculture during times of drought, and we're trying to recognize this connectivity of water across the landscape and between these different sectors of the physical environment, the social environment, and our economic needs. So identifying social vulnerability, how relationships in terms of access and delivery of scarce water works, and do we have policies to address this? To be able to look at the relationship of environmental sensitivity in terms of description and analysis of the water and the impacts of climate change on our access. And finally, thinking about technology and infrastructure that mediates how water is used. So an integrated approach to target relationships between scales of data needs, identifying adaptive capacity, and what thresholds in the environment and limitations of the society exist in terms of risk reduction when we're speaking about drought management. So one of the tools we can use is something called a causal loop diagram, and we want to consider this during times of drought. Its relationship to the hydrosocial cycle. I think the causal loop diagram is a useful tool for visualizing drought impacts and the drivers that can use these impacts or that cause these impacts. The elements or variables, all the different ways we collect the different data we need that help us understand these different impacts, the different drivers and the different interconnections between these different processes. So what does this example mean? The interconnections, these links identify the relationship between access to water and access availability. When access to water is impacted, it's going to have an impact on water availability that's opposite from if we have a rich supply of water versus a lower supply of water. So water availability allows us to understand then what are the impacts on reduced access to water, where less water means more impacts and increasing numbers of vulnerable populations that then impact us, and the different kinds of data that can help us understand these relationships between these linkages, the drivers, and these different types of variables. That's a causal loop diagram that I wanted to share with you. And with that, I'm passing it off to Timmy to talk about how we build causal loop diagrams and how we can use these with the 5 whys to further understand community perspectives. And I'll stop sharing here, Timmy, and hand it off to you.
To share this information with you, and I look forward to any future collaborations we may have. So you may be wondering, what is a causal loop, or what is the value in creating one? And as Mel mentioned, there are multiple subsystems working together that affect one another, hence the image I have at the top of my screen here. So if you affect one subsystem, you're likely to affect the rest of the other system. Hence the reason I put a watch at the bottom. These, of course, are the watches that we used to use before the iWatch. So what I'll present today is what causal loop diagrams are, what their values are in terms of drought management with collecting data from communities, but also how you may use them in your research. Just a moment. Okay. So one thing you can do here is you can build them with participants, these CLDs that are actually facing the problem. So many of farmers who are working or other agents that are consuming water during times of drought. You can get their perspectives in qualitative form. You can connect them in quantitative systems models. And then you can determine where the most effective interventions can be and diffused, or rather implemented, to have a systems level impact. So we build causal loops across subsystems and connect them, which will give you insights into system behavior, which many times will shed light why some interventions, drought interventions that is, or management strategies, work while others might be overrun by the wider system. That's why I have a tornado over the watch. So let's start with a common example here, common causal loop example, not just one that Mel had presented. This is called the predator-prey model, and I'm going to relate this into water management in just a bit. So follow the storyline, if you will. Beginning in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see, of course, we have an abundant prey population that can support a number of predators. But of course, those predators will deplete the prey population. And as the prey decreases, of course, predators will decrease, given that there's only a number that can feed them, allowing the abundant prey population to grow. The same can be said if you look here for causal loops. So think about in the upper left-hand corner, once again, of the abundant prey. So you have in the center here, prey population. And as it increases, you'll have more prey births and then in turn, that increases prey population. Same thing in terms of prey deaths, balancing the population. As the prey is dying, that of course decreases prey population, but that also decreases predator population. So pay attention to the bottom loop here. Predator births will increase, increasing predator population, but once again, those are balanced by deaths. So if you can see, there's two causal loop diagrams that were developed by two researchers that were from seemingly disparate or separate disciplines, which were connected to understand predators and prey dynamics. We can do the same in water dynamics or hydrosocial cycles. So as you see here, which I'll explain in a little bit more detail later, these loops were later used to develop stock and flow diagrams. Stocks, as you see on the bottom here, are representatives of fluctuating populations. And then the flows that look like a water line, those are rates that feed into or decrease the population of stocks. So think of this causal loop as the foundation of a house that you're building, which is going to inform the construction of the model later. If your foundation is sound, that is, the house is sturdy, will not blow over, and you can estimate what will happen to the ecosystem when different management strategies, such as drought management strategies, are diffused. I always put this in the bottom left-hand corner of these presentations here. You'll see knowing system behavior sometimes is more valuable than knowing parts of a system's model. Let's say, why is that? Well, if you recall in the 4 slides before, I spoke about system behavior as the system in many respects is more important than various stocks and flows that you'll construct in models to do drought management. Why is that? Because the better that we know how a system behaves, such as a hydrosocial cycle, the better we know how to respond to various interventions in the future. So in this case, if you think of the prey as water in the state of Rio Grande do Sul, and the predator as water consumers, we might see fluctuation or oscillation over time. So if we were to put a particular intervention that would express this type of oscillation, we might know in the future how best to diffuse interventions. So use this system behavior once again to inform your management decisions. For many of you attending, you can use this to guide an expected outcome that you like to have. So for example, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you may desire to have an aquifer or to exponentially grow over time, just in a small amount of time to restore the watershed. But later, that may be an issue for your district or the entire state of Rio Grande do Sul. Rather, you may desire something in the upper right-hand corner that will reach a certain amount where consumption is high, perhaps during growing season for agronomists and gauchos farming, but you need that to slow down. So still, if you look at these graphs in terms of hydrosocial cycles, they'll offer you insights as to why interventions may be delayed in terms of their success to your consumers, such as farmers who need irrigation. That's like the middle bottom graph you may be seeing here, or seem sporadic, like the one you're seeing in the lower left-hand corner. So stock and flow models that are built from causal loops, they'll explain a little bit of how to apply data to them to run models. I'll explain that, how to run models. But essentially what I'd like you to know, in running these models, you can use them with your stakeholders for multiple levels of the system to get a better group consensus about problems, but also why one intervention, or rather a group, is stuck to one intervention may not be as effective. No matter how opinionated it is, if you can get the group to have consensus about the system behavior, that might lead to better consensus or agreement rather on the intervention to select. So, as you might imagine, when you're building these models, it's going to come from many different actors in the system. They're also built by different views of the problem, ones that go wide out, ones that get closer. So someone from Rio Grande do Sul might have an understanding about the drought from a state level. Whereas if you go to Veracruz or Santa Maria, it might be a bit local to their home, their farm, their community. So how do you collect them? So say from a gaucho that has 10 hectares of land, or rather an organization that's facing multiple or hundreds of hectares in issues of drought. The most difficult thing we find sometimes is to connect all key actors' voices together, but more so is how do you get them to view the problem collectively as part of a hydro-social cycle? So first think about the problem. I'll provide an example for you below. And as you'll see, you want to first set the boundary. That's why you're seeing this square surrounding these three, or rather 4 loops here I put within Rio Grande do Sul up here. So as you see here, I've had 3 layers here that are affecting allowing aquifer. The problem statement, or the problem we're looking at after with multiple actors, is managing water availability and supply while considering socioeconomic implications. So at the top, you have socioeconomic activity of community members, perhaps state level members in Rio Grande do Sul. Then if you go to the lower, you have land and crop dynamics, perhaps between those who are cultivating rice, those who are cultivating soja. And then finally, there's a water availability factor that needs to be taken in place when you're looking at this problem. So as you might imagine, you can get these from multiple stakeholders, one perhaps from the farmer, another one from the agricultural agency, and then finally one from the environmental agent. So in your 5th step, when you're trying to develop these causal loops, you want to know who are these key actors. I'll put the perspectives here among farmers and various agencies, but perhaps you know who has a better perspective or who's facing that more at home. So in this 6th step, I started a loop just to get the perspective of form of a causal loop. So if you follow with me on the upper hand or at the center at the top, you'll see water demand. As water demand increases, so does food production, so supplying crops. But then as food production increases, so does tech development, such as boreholes across the state. These are developed to feed the food production, and as those increase, so does economic development across the state. And then finally, as economic development across the state increases, that also will support a farm population. And as the farm population increases, as you might imagine, so does water demand. So I've had local actors here describe, for instance, from their perspective, such as the agricultural agency, why water consumption may be increasing in the state or increasing drought. Each part of the loop, as you see, must be a noun. That is, it's neither negative or positive. It represents something that can decrease or increase. So essentially what I've explained is the story from a stakeholder's point of view. Now, here comes the fun part. You have to gather other perspectives based on the layers of a problem and see where the links are, perhaps in a hydrosocial cycle. So as you see here, I've linked, for instance, food production to market demand. As you all imagine, during the pandemic, demand had increased for soja and pork among Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, Paraná. And as that factor was increasing, also factors of climate change were increasing as well, which perhaps increased drought. Now you're seeing these links here. I've linked, for instance, 3 different voices from 3 seemingly disparate individuals. But these links are key for us to understand or may pinpoint where certain strategies are likely to affect the rest of the hydrosocial cycle. So when you think about interventions for drought management, you want to pay attention to these links that are in between the layers of problem, but also the layers of perspectives. Why is that? Because if you try to affect a certain part of someone's perspective about a problem in their local level, or rather something on the state level, without paying attention to these links, many times they're overread or overridden by the rest of the hydrosocial cycle. So it's best to understand where the links are to make higher level impact and also avoid overriding and overarching system behavior. So just to come back from the slide that I had mentioned to you before, we're discussing a number of individual opinions. You want to gain cooperative understanding about problems, but you also want to agree on appropriate interventions within an environment, their relationships, so that the output, that is the emerging behavior of a system, is not going to override the intervention. And if you can understand that, you can understand why certain interventions are more effective than others. If we were doing this in person, which I've done extensively across other countries and here in Santa Catarina, many times the way you do this is to form these causal loops and connect them with your stakeholders. You write or have them first state the name of an intervention that they've tried to address, but it is a systemic issue related to drought and perhaps why it failed. And then write or have them explain what had happened, why perhaps a part or subsystem had overridden that. And then finally, number 3, explain, did it only address one part of the system? And if so, why did that system override an intervention? So this is just 3 steps that you can share or happen to go over with your stakeholders to make for a more effective conversation and also gain a collective understanding about the problem in order to figure out what are more, or I want to say, effective interventions. At this time, I want to stop for a second. I want to stop sharing. I wanted to see if we needed a break or if everybody's okay. I think we're ahead of schedule right now, but unless I guess I can go ahead here, I just want to take consensus. Is that okay? I guess so.
It's a bit hard to do consensus in this situation. Take a dictatorial position here, but maybe this is also a good opportunity quickly to see if there are any questions on what you presented so far, which you and Dr. Leitori have presented so far, which I really appreciate you bringing the program down to earth here in our Teja Gaúcha. So if anybody listening, participating has any questions at this point, please feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your hand and we'll call on you. I'll just give it a moment here. Historically, in the other meetings, I know people have been shy, but today's our last day, so hopefully we should be comfortable with everyone. No question is a silly question, and I think this approach is particularly interesting, and hopefully for the people on the call, because the people on the call really do represent a diverse group of backgrounds. We have people from the state regulatory agency, from the state environmental agency, and from the state agricultural agency, which would likely have some contradictory views in terms of water resource management. So I think this approach is particularly important. So please, if anyone has anything to comment on or ask.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I'll jump in while we're waiting for people to comment. But if we were all together in one room, we would be working through these exercises to have you all be participating and engaging with each other to do a collaborative activity and tease out some of the perspectives you each have from your own agencies, from the own communities you work with, and how you experience issues with water yourselves. So thinking about doing that maybe in your head would be really helpful to do.
But it's perfectly fine though if you don't have any questions at this time though as well, if you had any comments. But yeah, I would want to echo Mel's comment, is that it's always key to understand not just someone else's voice, but rather their perspective as it's connected to the wider layered problem. So feel free to drop anything in the chat. That's okay. But I think we can just continue on here. That's fine. Let me show you first a simple exercise that you can use here if you would like to carry on with your stakeholders. So just go here, get to the next slide. How you create loops. There are a number of ways to collect the data should you wish to engage local stakeholders outside of academia, outside of federal agencies. And one way to do that is going through a simple technique that's developed by the Stanford Design School. It's called the 5 Whys. And what you do is you start with an issue in the form of a question at the top. And what you'll do is you'll go and have participants explain the causation between each outcome. These causations or statements will be used later to build causal loop models. So in this case, I want to just give you an example from perhaps an agency's perspective. Why is the aquifer decreasing in Rio Grande do Sul in a particular region? Someone might say, well, there's more demand for water. Why is that though? Oh, because there's higher food production. But why is there higher food production? Oh, because there's more tech that's supporting these. But why is there more tech supporting food production here? Because there's more advanced farmers within the region. But why are there more advanced farmers within the region? Because there's higher econ development that's developing them. So essentially, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of this slide, I have a hypothesis or a mental model, someone's belief system strongly about a problem. More water is drawn from advanced tech that is needed to support a growing population of farmers in Rio Grande do Sul that fuels econ development. It's a strong statement, it's a strong hypothesis about the problem. But what will happen is if we are there in person, you need a tool that take you away to use it. That is, if we're in person, how would you do it? And here are some examples you can use that I'll live here at the bottom. You might have, for instance, loss of land cover as a problem. Something such as increased runoff, slower recharge of an aquifer. These are all examples that you can do to, how we say, spark someone's 5 whys exercise to get better understanding about a multi-layered issue. And I'm showing here is I usually put people on a timer to figure these out so as to make for a more productive exercise. But how would you convert these 5 whys into causal loop diagrams? What happens is you would have an activity where you could list with stakeholders what are these quantifiable statements. That is, you'll assess each statement into quantifiable components. So for instance, if you look at the second statement, what do you see? Because there's high food production. So I'm hearing, oh, it must be soy or rice metric tons per annum per year. If I hear, for instance, in the third statement, oh, there's more tech, there's more boreholes. Oh, well then I would do number of boreholes as a quantifiable component of my causal loop. Same thing if I hear, for instance, econ development. What is quantifiable in that statement? Rio Grande do Sul GDP, gross domestic product per annum. Now, when you put these, just remember that not all of them are necessarily quantifiable, but the key thing is to get as many as you can. And then after, as you can see, I've created a causal loop from somebody's story, someone's hypothesis, someone's understanding about the problem. This aquifer level is increasing, or rather, the aquifer level has increased water demand. As water demand increases, so do metric tons of soya per annum for irrigation purposes strictly. As that increases, so does the number of boreholes, because that needs to support soja production. As the number of boreholes increases, is associated with farmland expansion, as you might imagine. And then as there's more farmland expansion, fueling more economic development, that decreases the aquifer levels. So we're stuck in this loop, so to speak. In connecting these quantifiable statements will indicate whether each part of the loop is positively or negatively affecting one another. As you might imagine in doing this with your stakeholders, one of the hardest things is to create the loop. People generally do not think, in systems, but rather cause and effect without a feedback outcome. So it's not to say that someone cannot see an issue such as drought from a systemic issue, but rather it's difficult to see themselves in a wider system. But doing so can inform us of better interventions or better understandings about a problem. So if you were to do this, if we were actually at Rio Grande do Sul, if we were actually perhaps in Porto Alegre, we would first go through these suggested steps. If someone went through the 5 whys exercise, what's quantifiable? Connect what's quantifiable to one another, and then indicate whether each statement is positively or negatively affecting the following statements. And as you might imagine, I have this timer set for 10 minutes because you want to make sure people are pushing through, and then you have discussion after. See here if I can get to my next. So how do you decide who decides to make these loops? And that's where we get into participatory mapping. I want to hand it off to Mel. Thank you.
Thanks. That was really excellent, Timmy. Thanks so much for laying all the groundwork on causal loop diagrams, the 5 whys, and how we can really start to wrap our minds around this idea of systems modeling, systems thinking. So I want to talk a little bit about how we use these tools through participatory methods to access local knowledge, because this helps to inform a different part of the hydrosocial cycle that we haven't really focused on as much in our workshops. We need to be considering local knowledge because it references a specific scale of reference and scale of relevance that prioritizes local perspectives. It's important in terms of how it allows us to consider the temporal and spatial aspects of communities, the importance of what's going on with respect to seasons, seasonality, how we track the impact of climate change and understand what's happening in people's everyday lives, which is a very local incidence of events. It's also important in terms of, again, like I've mentioned before, integrating across the physical and social sciences, understanding local practices, using local communities as data collectors, partnerships you might have with local schools or local universities to be training up the next generation of environmental managers who can be engaged with this local data collection to build stories and information about where they live and who they are. So one tool with respect to participatory methods is looking at participatory mapping. So this is engagement with the local community to learn their needs and perspectives through a spatial understanding of place. So taking those causal loop diagrams and actually overlaying those causal loops, looking at those loops in terms of where do these drivers manifest themselves on the landscape? How do we understand information that can help us to assess access to water, how water is being used, where it's being delivered to, all of these issues that we need to understand from a local perspective that it's often imposed by the state or by the national level to say this is how water is delivered. So participatory mapping is a process of production and engagement with the community to work with their agenda and their perspectives and being able to understand what their priorities might be. It also is a particular format in terms it's a spatial format. So going from those diagrams to thinking about maps and how maps are so important for being able to share perspectives and really creating that common language where we're able to be understanding the places in which we live. So first of all, when we start to do participatory methods, we need to identify the community. Who are we talking to? We've mentioned before ranchers, we've mentioned farmers, there's local communities, there's all kinds of different representatives. And so who speaks for the community is really important to understand. As we work with our different projects, being able to have outreach to local leaders and having connections with those local leaders to be able to identify other people that may contribute to issues and to the conversation that will take place. Ways that we inform the community so that they know something is going on and having them be aware that people are working to try to solve problems and it's working across the collective suite of representatives. And ways to obtain consent from participants and outreach to all sectors of the community. So these are just a few examples of groups that I've worked with. Elders in Alaska, in Alaskan villages, women's groups in Botswana to understand issues that have to do with native species, working with fishermen in Papua New Guinea, and working with herder groups in Mongolia and Ethiopia. So we're taking time to identify who those partners are and who the community people are. So in terms of participatory mapping, it's a tool where we can do sketch mapping, simply on a blank piece of paper and having the community work together to identify their specific needs. This is an example where we were mapping invasive species in a series of villages in Ethiopia. And so people came together in groups to be able to identify where the invasive species were moving from and to, where water sources are. The invasive species was water hungry, so they needed to manage this particular species, particularly in times of drought in this particular location. How did they have to manage their herds? Where would they be able to plant their crops? All of these kinds of issues. And so we were able to access and develop methods to think about how we might manage and remove Prosopis, which was an invasive species. We transformed these spaces into places by taking the data we had collected out in the field and being able to go out and identify using GPS and handheld devices these particular key locations of where the species was moving from and to, and where other important point locations were, and overlaying that sketch map onto a topographic map, and being able then to start integrating different types of data, different types of information. A topographic map is a very different product than a sketch map. And so being able to integrate across these different sectors of how data is collected and used was the next step to create this visual representation of their sketch map on a topographic map. But then we also took their terms that they were using and we created word clouds. We created word clouds of what were the issues that were discussed during the mapping process. And so what were the key things that were the key priorities for these different communities? And this was an important visual to be able to share across villages to start comparing what were the priorities and what was intersecting across these different locations. Sketch maps, after we go out and collect GPS marks and be able to use handheld devices for georeferencing, can be overlaid on satellite images. So some of the data that we've been looking at from our partners that were in our previous workshops, that satellite imagery can be used as base maps for transforming local data and integrating across these very different ways of understanding places. So using a satellite image, using some of the soil moisture maps, using these sketch maps, and being able to understand where things are happening and having an impact and identifying these local perspectives and local needs. We conducted transect walks. So it's another tool we can use. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, working out in the field where we go and collect data, walk around with community members to be able to collect information about specific locations, using it as a sampling strategy for a different statistical analysis that we might do. So we were looking at traditional plants for conservation in Botswana. The central government had created a law that said all villages shall develop a conservation management plan. And so an aspect of that was working with the villages to identify traditional plants for two purposes. One was for conservation needs and one was for marketing, because there's a market for traditional plants and these villagers wanted to be able to participate in market-based activities. And then another example, looking at the Alaska example again, where we did mapping of the winter season in Alaska to understand harvesting strategies and hunting strategies during the winter time. The important aspect about this was really starting to track climate change in Alaska, which is experiencing much milder winters than they used to have. And the main means of travel in Alaska during this time is using snow machines. Suddenly they can't use snow machines to get to their harvesting sites or their hunting sites because the rivers are not freezing over and they're not getting as much snow. So we conducted we created a seasonal calendar with our partners there to understand how this was all changing and tracking this change over time and transportation needs, as well as creating an online atlas for the community to be able to use to ascertain the kinds of data and information we were collecting at the local scale for them to understand this intersection of all these different types of data sources that they could use for better managing their villages. Finally, the last example is looking at changing land use patterns in Papua New Guinea, where they were using subsistence practices in terms of agriculture, fishing, and forestry, harvesting the forest. They were going to have a mine located upstream from their village, and they wanted to develop a comprehensive data set that described their village resources to protect their resources from the construction of the mine upstream. We did all kinds of mapping using satellite-based images, brought these back to the community for validation, and we're able to share these with the village to be able to have them share this with higher levels of administration to try to ensure protection of their resources and conservation. We created a photo voice product from this, which created a whole series of videos that are now used in the local schools so that they can be able to understand their resources. And again, this idea of training from the very young ages onward, future managers for tomorrow. So with that, that's sort of some of the examples that we have for looking at participatory methods with a particular emphasis on geospatial activities. So these are methods that work with communities, with farmers and ranchers. They're a mix of tools to gather local data that can complement the other data sets we've been examining in these series of workshops. So what can be done with this data then is that community data based on community perceptions from our causal loop diagrams, from asking about the root causes of the 5 whys, can inform systems thinking to create models for problem solving, as well as using these participatory tools. Now, I don't know if we're ready for a break now, or if we want to shift back to Timmy, because he's going to talk about systems thinking.
I'll leave it to our host here, Chandra, but I guess we can carry on unless you need for a break.
I think we can go a little further. And Timmy, I'm following the schedule. Is this the final part of your presentation that's coming up?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
All right. I think that maybe we'll forego breaks at the risk of losing audience, but I do see Diego who's come on screen, and he is one of our most vocal audience members. So I welcome Diego if you have a question, and please, anyone else, if you have a question in the interim, feel free to pop in.
Só um minuto.
Just a minute.
Não seria especificamente uma
It
questão,
wouldn't
mas
be specifically a
apenas
question,
reagindo assim ao que
just
foi colocado
reacting to what was said
dentro do sistema de gestão de
within
recursos
the
hídricos.
management system for water
Existe
resources. There's
participação da sociedade
participation of the
através dos
society
comitês de
through the
gestão de bacia
management
hidrográfica.
committees
E
of
essa
the
representação se dá
watersheds, and this
através
representation is
dos
done through
usuários dos recursos hídricos.
the
Então,
users of water
agricultores,
resources,
geração de energia
agricultures,
elétrica,
farmers,
setor de abastecimento,
energy users,
e
the
dentro dos
supply,
comitês são
and
trabalhados
within the
os planos
communities
de
we
recursos
work with
hídricos, onde
the
são
water resource
definidas as
plans, where we
prioridades
define
dos
the
usos dos recursos
priorities
hídricos. Tá?
for the uses
O
of
fato
water resources.
que,
The
apesar
fact,
da gente estar passando por uma
even though
estiagem
we're
já
going
pelo
through a
terceiro,
drought
entrando no terceiro, quarto ano,
for the third,
não
fourth year,
ocorreu ainda,
it hasn't
os
happened
principais
yet.
impactos estiveram
The
associados a
main
perdas
impacts were
econômicas do
associated to
setor de
economic
agropecuária.
losses in the
Alguns poucos municípios passaram por problemas de
the
abastecimento
animal
público, tá?
production area.
Mas não se vê aqui, por exemplo,
We don't see
movimentação de massa de
movement,
população, assim, de grandes deslocamentos
mass
populacionais
movement.
por conta
We
desse
don't
área.
see demographic
Então,
changes because of that.
nesse estágio, as
At this
tomadas de
stage,
decisão
the
assim,
decision
ainda estão
making
concentradas no poder
is still
público.
focused on
Não
the
se vê
public
ainda
power. We
aquela
don't
questão
see
de
yet
tomada de decisão por
the
parte de
decision
comunidades
making
locais,
by local communities
como em algumas situações mais extremas.
in
Agora,
like
o
as
que foi
in more
colocado aqui
extreme
é muito
situations.
importante e me ressaltou
It's
muito
really
a questão
important
da
highlighting
importância
the
do poder público municipal
importance
dentro
of
desse
the
processo. Tá?
municipal public power in this process.
Essa é uma questão que a gente
This
vai
is
ter que
an
começar a enfrentar,
issue
porque a
we're
impressão
going to
que
start
a
to
gente tem é
face.
que se
The
espera
idea that we
muito do
have is
poder
that
público
people
federal e do
expect
poder
way too
público
much from
estadual.
federal level and state
Então, é
level
uma
administration,
abordagem
and
interessante para a gente
it's an
considerar
interesting
como
approach
exemplo.
for us to
Então,
consider
de minha
as an
parte era
example.
isso. Tá?
That's what
Deixo
I
a
had to
palavra
say
para
for
outros
now.
colegas.
I give the mic back to my colleagues.
Chandra, do you mind if I respond? It's okay. Diego, obrigado for your response there. I think first, one of the things you mentioned, right, is that there's less action, I think, in the beginning. To come back is to say that stakeholders, for those who are focusing on supporting farming systems, those who are paying attention to watersheds, haven't necessarily felt the production impact yet, right? Because generally, right, if you flick on your news, if you've flicked on Tela, these famous news stations, it's a snapshot, right? This is generally comes from econometrics or statistic thinking, because we need to look at impact, something that grabs your attention right away. However, those later effects, right? If the news was telling, for instance, about an accident that happened on such and such date, but 3 weeks prior to that accident happening, it says, hey, okay, we're at this level right now, let's pay attention. The next week we're at this level now for a water level, let's pay attention now, we're at this water level. So I think many times if we were to be reporting gradually about what was occurring on a constant view, it's not necessarily exciting, but I just don't think the societies are paying attention to a problem from a systems level, but rather a linear level, something that's just a snapshot in time that's happened on a certain date, but we're paying attention to the moment that was coming up. You mentioned the other thing about waiting for federal level to move, right? So I often wonder is, many times when you inform these research actions, participatory research actions, you're putting a lot of encouragement or obligation on those who are actually feeling the problem. What do I mean by that is, if you were to bring somebody that would explain a problem to you and they have to justify it, I often think through a 5 whys exercise, they've essentially invested their credibility, I think, into why something might be happening. Hence the reason that they actually might have a little more investment into the intervention that would be rolled out. So I often think many times our interventions, not necessarily in drought management, are not necessarily effective, not just because of not seeing something from a systems level, but they're being implemented by perhaps an agency or a federal agency that did not receive consensus from the end user, that is the person who's actually consuming the water or affecting the landscape system. However, if the individual had felt that their voice was heard and was used in the actual planning of the intervention or the management strategy, perhaps the receptivity to how it was being implemented might be a bit more receptive than as to those who were just rolling out a problem or rolling out an intervention without any say-so. That's personally how I would feel if someone was implementing a stricter drought management intervention, which I had no say, no vote, and no information to contribute to that intervention. So I often think in these participatory methods that we're presenting here, you're putting somebody's credibility on the table, whether it's a farmer, whether it's a minister, whether it's an agricultural technician. They have invested their knowledge to inform a rather intervention, and would be much more receptive if that was actually rolled out. When I say roll out, implemented, because they felt that, yeah, I was part of that. So just a thought there. I'll stop.
I would also just piggyback on that and say that there are communities that have adaptive capacity, that have specific strategies for dealing with extreme conditions. Sometimes we are aware of them and sometimes we are not. And so these participatory activities raise awareness of how well communities are able to adapt to change, and who we might be interacting with, who are the leaders in that community, that then we can be making linkages with the appropriate agencies and the appropriate types of intervention to enhance the outcome of that intervention.
Thank you so much, Diego, for bringing up this point, and for Timmy and Mel for your responses. I think it's, this program has brought so many different ideas together, and I'm really excited that this particular idea and this particular focus to think of a systems perspective for drought management might be one that begins to percolate here. As I know, Diego, you've expressed, and your colleagues have expressed, that this is drought is not new to Rio Grande do Sul, but a tailored, prolonged drought management program is something new. So really thank you all for bringing this perspective. Please, and thank you as well for the very concrete examples in different places in the world, which I think also might stimulate some ideas here. If there are no other questions or comments at this time, maybe we'll head into our last bit of the presentation. Should we just go for it?
Let's go for it. Let's go to the finish line. All right. Here we go. Share my screen here. So, Mel had left off talking about, participatory mapping that can inform various models. And I want to talk about stock and flow models because that informs perhaps a systems level perspective. You can use participatory mapping to inform how you build these models, because the activity that you're conducting with stakeholders on the ground will indicate subparts of a wider hydrosocial cycle. So let me show how that works here. It might be a little difficult to see, but here's a stock and flow model here in the lower left-hand corner. I made this using the previous loop that was explained to you just a few minutes ago. And as you recall, these loops indicate the core structure that you can build out in a stock and flow diagram. So if you start here with the rectangle, starting in the upper left, you have available surface water, which is either being removed or being replaced by available groundwater. That is also being taken away from groundwater withdrawal. Then it comes back into water supply. That's the next square that you see there. And then that water slide feeds back into surface water and available surface water. So as you can see, is these loops, these causal loops, these are the core structures of the program, or rather the model. But if you kind of build out where you have precipitation in the upper left-hand corner, that's rainfall data that can be fed into that parameter of a stock and flow model. We have water demand in the upper right-hand corner that's connected to flows, so that can be informed by irrigation from multiple farmers, and agricultural demand if you look in the bottom right of this model here. And these all can be informed by your key stakeholders in your system. Now, I'm sure a lot of this, because I'm talking about hypotheses, might seem, we say, arbitrary, might seem quite subjective, because it's just coming from an end user, a stakeholder's point of view. But there is scientific literature out there for the past 20 years that can confirm whether these hypotheses are valid from participants. As you can see, I've listed two and came across a plethora of publications, but just one of which that comes from Brazil, And those loops were actually informed by a systems model for environmental management in the Sepetiba Bay watershed. But there's others that have been used this similar causal loop model that you're seeing here, that's in white, blue, and red. The same one not only informed the 2006 publication, but also the 2021. So a lot of these bases, these causal loops that form these, I'd like to say, stock and flow models, these houses, they can confirm whether your hypotheses are grounded in, like to say, evidence or truth. So how do I identify these parts of the loop? So how do you bring a causal loop into a stock and flow model? So as you might imagine here is you need to identify parts that are populations, those are stocks, and then those that are rates, those are flows. So if you think of the aquifer level in a given region, Rio Grande do Sul, that would be a stock. And then if you have farmland expansion over time, from soja, you have, for instance, the suinoculturas that were increasing over time, Santa Maria, that would be a flow, that would be an increased population over time. And then of course I put at the bottom, for instance, number of boreholes within a given region. Again, it's population, it's stock. So after you gather these within your loops, you can locate, as you might imagine, these stocks within each of the stock and flow programs, or rather models. And then you can connect rates in between them. So generally, if you were to look at this model, what you would do with stakeholders is you generally begin with the stocks, the populations, these rectangles that you see in the model, and then connect the rates or the flows in between them. And doing that one step at a time doesn't overwhelm your participants or the stakeholders that you wish to work with. It creates buy-in as they feel part of the ultimate goal of the system is to assess and develop drought management strategies. Now, again, this is just quite a simple model that I've developed specifically for this Facilitate workshop. But as you might imagine, you can build out, you can make these much more, to say like complicated or complex, hydrosocial cycle. And if you might imagine, if you had scientists, social scientists, or community leaders, they might form this rectangle or square in the upper right-hand corner to form the socioeconomic subsystem. You might have hydrologists that will form the upper left-hand corner. And then finally, you could have agricultural subsystems. Now, individuals like myself, we end up, because we're systems engineers, we end up finding where the connections are in between these subsystems and building these. But through these facilitation activities, you can make extremely accurate models through stakeholder voices. And a lot of these are in the literature. I've listed one here, which is the art of system dynamics to integrate water resource modeling or management. And I just want to reiterate, when you see these causal loops, as complex as these stock and flow models may appear, they're all informed by hypotheses from the stakeholders, people who are on the ground facing these issues and these problems. And after you build out these, what you can do with these stock and flow models, you can have discussions with your stakeholders after as to say, who do you speak to in order to get this data? Who does it come from? So I've indicated some sources here, for instance, at the top, you have available water sources getting from the Ministério do Ambiente. There's other models or flows or rates that you could get, for instance, such as agricultural water use. You can get that from a gaúcho who might be irrigating 10 hectares of land. You can contact Embrapa. They have various databases that I've used myself to determine how to apply data to these stock and flow models so that in the future you can run them. So I've listed here a brief summary of the modeling steps that you have. And just to review, because it's always good to iterate and cement how these processes work, you have to look at previous models or physical description of the system. That's, as I mentioned before, that kind of look like a tree ring with 4 rings around them, just to get physical idea of a problem with a group of stakeholders. You're interviewing them, getting their conceptual knowledge, that is their hypotheses about a problem. That's where the causal loop comes in, the qualitative model, because that'll get a systems understanding. Then from there, you can have a mathematical description of the system or the problem. That's where the stock and flow I just presented comes in. And you can apply that with historical data and run the model finally to inform decision making or a policy assessment just to see which interventions are most effective. Now, the final question is, in what manner do we collect the data? Because in the end, it's going to calibrate the model. A lot of times we're coming to communities that have sensitive information of how they're allocating or using water for their own economic development purposes. So how do you go about that ethically? I'm going to hand that back over to Mel.
Okay, thanks, Timmy. That was really great to be able to look at this situation in terms of systems thinking. What I just kind of want to reiterate here is these are very simple tools actually for discussing complex issues and complex problems. And you can see how complex they get very quickly by all those arrows and loops all over those different models. So we went over causal loop diagrams. We talked about the 5 whys, all within the structure of this hydrosocial cycle. We looked at exercises such as sketch mapping and these simple stock and flow models. And the key thing about operationalizing these tools is making sure we work with a mixture of stakeholders so that we're doing the proper sort of engagement with different groups of people so they understand how water is being utilized and managed across the landscape. I think that we could take these stock and flow models, these system models, and make them spatial. I think that's an activity and an exercise to do, to be able to tie them to places to create explicit solutions for decision-making and comparative results. But in working with communities, we have to ensure that we behave ethically. Things like making sure that we get informed consent. We're working with local communities, disclosure, permissions, anonymity, that we're being very aware of diversity and the role it plays in looking at these issues, social and cultural differences and inclusion. Understanding transparency, making sure we're accountable for how this data will be used moving forward, and being adaptive to changing conditions. What might we have to change? We might have to not look at some issue or include something else, and how are we able to do that? Many of you work at universities, and so you probably have an institutional review board process in terms of managing how you engage with their communities. And then just sort of general responsibility for participatory methods, giving ownership of the outcomes to communities and sharing products all along the way. This is essential in terms of being able to, again, build those long-term relationships that's going to be needed for trying to address these seemingly intractable environmental problems that we're facing. Ways to ensure access and distribution of any of the products. If we create a stock and flow diagram and we start to create maps, how are they shared and how are they accessed over time and space? How might they be obtained and maintained and updated? And who's responsible? What sort of, resources are given to local communities to ensure continuity and sustainability? But I think we need to be thinking about long-term connections, much as the opening comments mentioned, trying to create these relationships and talk about these issues between our countries in these very local areas, trying to solve these seemingly intractable problems associated with drought. And with that, Timmy and I went over and over what we were going to cover, and we thought this was going to take all kinds of time. And if we were doing participatory things, we would have used up more of our time. But we actually finished quite early, so we have some time for questions and comments. And thank you very much. Here's our contact information.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much. Really, especially for this fantastic conclusion. What a great note to end on, emphasizing inclusivity, ownership, community, respect, and ethics as we think here about building resilience programs, drought management programs specifically, but I think these are some ideas that we don't hear very, very often in consideration of what are generally very technical policies. Not that this isn't technical, it's another technical aspect that we should consider. So really, thank you both. What a wonderful note to end on. And of course, I don't think anybody minds ending something early, and we do miss the opportunity to be in the same place and go through these exercises, because I would have really, really liked to see what would have come out of them. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity to do that in the future, and maybe get you down here to the south. So I do want to give a moment for our audience to digest, to think if there are any immediate questions. I, as somebody living here for a very short period of time, am very curious to hear how this particular conversation resonates. I know we have people from FIPIN on the line who are licensors, giving licenses for land use and resource use, and I would love to hear how this lands with anyone working there. I know we have some Agricultural Federation representatives on the line as well. This is really an opportunity for you to share ideas, bounce ideas off of our experts. If you have any, please feel free to raise your hand or go ahead and unmute yourself or drop a message in the chat. I see Sinara on the screen.
Olá,
Please.
boa tarde.
Boa tarde.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Sinara. I work with irrigation, actually, and we have more colleagues watching us. We thank the opportunity of having you this afternoon, and certainly all this debate, and the presentations that you guys made today are very positive, because we can exercise our thinking altogether, understanding all the issues. I mean, the problematic is not only ours. Drought is nothing new in Rio Grande do Sul, and facing the droughts, the drought management and all the strategies and how to mitigate the problem, it's a challenge. It keeps being a challenge. And together, we can really learn more and more from each other, learn better things, and how we can really face these challenges. So the balance among social, productive solutions, in also conserving the environment is our goal. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
I'm going to follow up quickly on that. Thank you for those comments. In the United States right now, we are also experiencing an extreme drought in the Western United States. The Colorado River Basin, which one is the key water provider across the Western United States, is an extreme drought. And we're starting to have to make decisions about what people cannot do, what people in cities cannot do, changing their patterns with respect to the kinds of plants they have in their yards. Farmers have to delay being able to put down crops and maybe not have a season for alfalfa this year. Methods whereby we are trying to determine how best to manage these trade-offs, and it's going nowhere. People have to make very important decisions, and we are frozen and not being able to do anything right now because we don't have enough different opportunities to enhance and increase the dialogue to understand what all of our options are. So this is topical, this is right now, this is trying to figure out how do we all get to talk together. So you raise a really, really important point in terms of this issue of challenges, conservation, and communication.
Sinara, obrigado, prazer te conhecer. I just want to say is that to piggyback, as we say in English, to follow up with Mel's comment here is that there are a number of interventions, I believe, that can be rolled out, and some, as Mel said, we're just stuck we haven't necessarily moved forward on them because there's trade-offs, right? However, in many times with these participatory modeling tools, decision-making tools that you can use, in running scenarios with, I think, a larger group, you can create a consensus about what those trade-offs are and which trade-offs you're willing to make. So that being said, there is no, as we say, silver bullet. However, if the society, if it was up to make the trade-off, rather not necessarily the intervention decision, what is the management decision, but rather if you put society, those stakeholders on the ground, is what are they willing to bear? What trade-off are they willing to bear? That's more when those interventions actually necessarily move forward. Many times, I think, as Mel has mentioned, we get stuck on the intervention, the management prior, that's coming from technicians, that's coming from agencies or ministries. But what we're trying to figure out actually within these models, which they can offer to us later, is what are the trade-offs? What are the trade-offs that society is willing to bear? The economic, the environmental, the social, what are these? And I think one of the most effective things that we've done, I think in the past, is using these models, running them with our stakeholder groups and assessing what trade-offs are they willing to make so that we can mobilize and move forward with them, as opposed to just standing still and saying, oh, if we try this intervention, it gives us this. If we try this one, this will occur. But rather, if we can compare those across all and run them, those scenarios, hypothetical scenarios, I think we're a little bit quicker to respond to drought.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Sinara, for sharing that. Of course, we have experts from a US perspective, but this is a cooperation program, and exactly that. Rio Grande do Sul is no newcomer to drought, and it's definitely an opportunity for us to learn from your perspective as much as it is the other way around. So I really do hope that this conversation and this program is the start of really developing this particular area in terms of our cooperation. So thank you for that point. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to share or comment or ask about at this point? Well, I'm hesitant to conclude, so I'll give you your time if there's anything you'd like to share. And if not, there are definitely opportunities to continue this conversation. So thank you to our visiting experts today for sharing your contact information with the group. I really appreciate you being resources, not only for all of us here, but going forward maybe on a more tailored level. From my end, I've just dropped in the chat a short survey if you'd like to share more information about what you got out of this event, specifically today, and this program. If you want to share your information with the Consulate so that we have it, so we can share future programming of the like with you, you can fill out that form. Before I conclude, I see Secretario Domingos is still with us, and I want to give Secretario Domingos the opportunity to say any words if you'd like. Not sure if you would. All right. Well, with that, and with a great deal of gratitude to our visiting experts for their time, their thoughtfulness, these really wonderful presentations, which I have, and I hope I have your permission, Dr. Leitori and Dr. Silberg, to share. I'm getting ready to wrap up. I'd like to give a big thanks to our partners here in Rio Grande do Sul for helping to develop this program, to our partners in the Department for Hydraulic Resources at SEMA, for our partners in the Secretariat for Agriculture, and for all others who have participated in putting this program together. Thank you specifically to the secretaries who have been individually and personally involved in this program, Secretary Domingos and Secretary Marjorie, who have been our really strong partners. And one of the biggest thanks to the Department of Interior International Technical Assistance Program. Elizabeth Goffey, who's on the line and who really made this event happen, getting wonderful experts really working to tailor the program. And I'm just so impressed with the caliber, expertise, and really locality of the experts we've had, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Secretary Domingos, if you want to say any concluding words before we wrap up the program, you're welcome to.
Thanks, Alexandra. It's always a big pleasure to see the outcomes of this work with the competence of the American experts and our Brazilian technicians too, Diego and Sinara, who were here. So this exchange of information is key. And I'd like to also repeat that we're very satisfied with this first work, and is the first of many, is the seed for many other workshops and talks, because this is a very strong work on sustainability and environment preservation, as well as the harmony among our people. So please stay always with us. It's important on behalf of our governor too. I'd like to say that this mission will be brought, this successful example of this cooperation with you. It's been amazing, and it's important to solve problems of both countries and so many other countries, working collaboratively with you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretario, for prestigiar este evento. Sorry, translators, I don't know how to say prestigiar in English, but it's a fabulous word and describes the gratitude that I want to give to the Secretary and to his team, Diego, Sinara, who have been really active participants and encouraged all the participants on the call today to get here. So thank you so much. Thank you to our experts. Thank you to Elizabeth and the Department of Interior. Thanks, Diego. And with that, we'll conclude our program. I'll stay on for a minute or two in case there are any additional comments, questions. Elizabeth is also online in case you have specific questions for her. Great to see you, and thank you. The presentation, today's recording, will be online on the Department of Interior's ITAP YouTube channel. I'm happy to share that. You can also look it up on YouTube. I'll drop the link in the chat so you know where to look in the future. And we look forward to our next event together in some way, shape, or form with any of you on the line or your colleagues. Please keep in touch, and thank you so much.